The rain in the city didn't wash things clean. It only turned the grime into a slick, oily sheen that reflected the neon nightmares of the district. Arthur Sullivan stepped out of the back of his armored sedan, the heel of his Italian leather shoe clicking against the wet pavement with the authority of a king. To the world, he was Arthur Sullivan, the iron-fisted architect of a multi-billion-dollar shipping empire. To the underworld, he was the ghost of the docks, a man who had navigated 3 decades of gang wars without a single scar on his face. He adjusted the lapel of his charcoal overcoat, the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain clinging to him. Beside him, his most trusted lieutenant, Tommy Miller, held a black umbrella with practiced precision. Tommy had been there for 20 years, the shield at Arthur's back, the silence in his ear. "The meeting is set, boss," Tommy murmured, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "The families are waiting inside the Black Vault. They're ready to sign the treaty." Arthur nodded, his gaze sweeping the entrance of the exclusive club. It was a fortress of glass and steel, guarded by men he had handpicked for their loyalty. He took a step toward the heavy mahogany doors, his mind already calculating the profit margins of the new alliance. Then it happened. A hand, small and trembling, shot out from the shadows of a nearby alleyway. Fingers caked in dirt and numb with cold gripped the expensive silk of Arthur's sleeve. The guards reacted instantly, hands flying to their holsters, but Arthur raised a hand to stop them. There was something about the grip, not the desperate tug of a beggar, but the grounding anchor of someone drowning. He looked down into the face of a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, though the hollows under her eyes suggested she had lived a century. She was wrapped in a tattered, oversized military jacket, her hair a matted nest of copper and ash. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. They were a piercing, terrifying blue wide with a frantic, prophetic light. She leaned in, her breath smelling of nothing but the cold air, and pressed her cracked lips close to his ear. "Run now, Minjay," she whispered. The world stopped. The sound of the rain, the hum of the idling sedan, the distant throb of the club's music. It all vanished into a vacuum of white noise. Minjay. Arthur Sullivan hadn't heard that name in 24 years. It was the name of a boy who had died in a burning tenement in Seoul. It was the name of a ghost he had murdered himself when he reinvented his identity to climb the bloody ladder of the Western syndicates. No one alive knew that name. No one. He froze, his boots feeling as though they were fused to the concrete. He looked at the girl, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "What did you say?" he rasped, his voice cracking for the first time in decades. She didn't answer. She only backed away into the shadows, her eyes never leaving his. "The fire is coming," she breathed, her voice a ghostly echo. "Boss? Is something wrong?" Tommy's voice broke through the paralysis. He reached out to touch Arthur's shoulder. "We need to get inside. The schedule." "Wait," Arthur commanded, his instincts, the ones that had kept him alive when better men had fallen, screaming in a frequency only he could hear. He looked at the Black Vault. He looked at the guards. And then he looked back at the empty space where the girl had been just seconds before. "Back to the car," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "Sir." Tommy looked confused, his grip tightening on the umbrella. "The treaty." "I said back to the sea. Now." Arthur spun on his heel, shoving Tommy toward the sedan. The guards hesitated for a split second, confused by the sudden retreat of their unflappable leader. That split second saved their lives. The explosion didn't start with a sound. It started with a pressure wave that buckled the street. The front of the Black Vault disintegrated in a roar of orange flame and shattered glass. The mahogany doors he had been seconds away from touching turned into lethal shrapnel. The force of the blast threw Arthur against the side of the armored car. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. Through the haze of smoke and falling debris he saw the club, the place where he was supposed to be sitting at the head of the table, transformed into a funeral pyre. Everyone inside, the heads of the 5 major families, his associates, his rivals. They were gone. Arthur slumped against the cold metal of the car, gasping for air that tasted of sulfur and burnt upholstery. He looked down at his sleeve. The spot where the girl had gripped him was still damp from her touch. She had called him Minjay. She had told him to run. And because he had listened to a nameless girl from the gutter, he was the only survivor of the greatest massacre in the city's history. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Arthur's eyes scanned the dark alleyways, his mind spinning. Who was she? How did she know the name he had buried under a mountain of bodies? And most importantly, who had just tried to kill him? The mystery wasn't just about the bomb. It was about the girl who saw the future and the past in the same terrifying glance. Arthur Sullivan was alive, but the man known as Min-jae was finally being hunted. The safe house was a brutalist slab of concrete tucked behind a legitimate-looking auto salvage yard in the industrial district. Inside, the air was sterile, smelling of ozone and expensive scotch. Arthur Sullivan sat on the edge of a leather sofa, his hands steady, though his mind was a storm of jagged glass. A private medic had already come and gone, tending to the minor abrasions from his fall, but no medicine could touch the phantom ache in his chest that came with hearing his birth name. For 24 years, Arthur had been a ghost story. He had arrived in this country with nothing but a blood-stained shirt and a cold, serrated edge where his heart used to be. He had built this life brick by bloody brick, ensuring that every person who knew the boy named Min-jae was either buried in the hills of Gyeonggi or silenced by time. He stood up, walking to a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the rain-slicked shipyard. He stared at his reflection. At 52 he was a man of sharp angles and silvering temples. He was the ghost, a man who possessed everything and belonged to no one. But beneath the bespoke suit and the cold exterior, there was a hollowness, a deep-seated desire for a legacy that wasn't written in ink and lead. He had spent decades trying to buy back his soul, donating millions to orphanages and hospitals, a silent penance for the sins of a past life. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flickering orange glow of the fires he had set as a young enforcer. "Boss, the perimeter is locked down. My men are scouring the city for the girl." Tommy Miller entered the room, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. Tommy was a man of iron and loyalty, his face a map of scars earned in Arthur's service. They had met in the trenches of a dockside turf war 2 decades ago. Tommy had taken a bullet meant for Arthur, and since that day they had been more than employer and employee. They were brothers forged in the furnace of the underworld. "She knew," Arthur whispered, not turning around. "She knew the name my mother gave me, Tommy." "How is that possible?" Tommy stepped closer, his expression a mask of concerned loyalty. "It's a trick, Arthur. Someone did their homework. They found a lead on your past and used that girl as a mouthpiece to throw you off. To make you hesitate so the bomb could do its work." "No," Arthur snapped, finally turning to face him. His eyes were hard. "She didn't sound like a hired gun. He sounded like she was terrified for me. And she spoke it like a prayer, not a threat." He paced the room, his mind racing. "And the explosion. The timing was too perfect. If I had walked through those doors, I wouldn't be a corpse. I'd be ash. The only reason I'm standing here is because a girl who looks like she lives in a cardboard box knew a secret that should have died in another country." Tommy nodded slowly, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife he always kept strapped to his belt. "Then we find her. She knows the name, she knows the source. I've got the boys hitting every soup kitchen, every shelter under the bridge. If she's on the streets, we'll drag her out." "Find her," Arthur commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "But Tommy, don't hurt her. I need to talk to her. I need to know who she is." While the underworld burned with the news of the Black Vault massacre, 3 miles away, in the dripping dampness of an abandoned subway maintenance tunnel, Elisa Vance huddled against a rusting pipe. Elisa was 19, but her soul felt like an ancient, frayed tapestry. She lived in the world of the between. To most, the world was a linear progression of seconds and minutes. For Lisa, time was a fractured mirror. Ever since the night her world ended, the night a man with cold eyes had stood over her parents' bodies while her childhood home turned into an inferno, her mind had been broken. Or perhaps it had been opened. She didn't call them visions. She called them the screams. They hit her like a physical blow. A sudden, blinding migraine followed by a flash of what was about to happen. A car crash on 4th Street. A stabbing in the park. And today, the fire. She rocked back and forth, her copper hair shielding her face. Her head throbbed with the aftershocks of the warning she had given. She hadn't wanted to save him. For years she had seen that man's face in her nightmares. He was the monster from her past. But when the vision had hit her this morning, the sight of his body being torn apart by the blast, something inside her had broken. The guilt of knowing and doing nothing was a weight she couldn't carry anymore. You shouldn't have done it, Elisa. A shadow detached itself from the tunnel wall. A man stepped into the dim light of her flickering lantern. He was tall, dressed in a tactical jacket that cost more than most people in this district made in a year. It was a man she knew, a man who had been her guardian in the cruelest sense of the word for the last 3 years. They're looking for you now, the man said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. I told you to stay in the shadows. I told you your gift was for us alone. Elisa looked up, her blue eyes wide and glazed with tears. I couldn't let him die like that, Llewellyn. Not even him. Llewellyn Vane, a man who worked in the dark corners of the city's power structures, sighed. He was the one who had found Elisa shivering in a mental ward years ago. He was the one who realized her delusions were actually a tactical goldmine. He had kept her hidden, fed her enough to keep her alive, and used her flashes of the future to orchestrate the rise of certain players, and the fall of others. He was supposed to die today, Elisa, Llewellyn said, stepping closer. That was the plan. The transition of power was supposed to be clean. Now because of your conscience, the ghost is still walking. And he's angry. He called himself Minjae, she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked so small when I said it. Like a little boy. Llewellyn's eyes narrowed. He isn't a boy. He's a predator. And now he's a predator who knows someone is hunting him. He reached down, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her to her feet. We're moving. The city isn't safe for you anymore. If Sullivan finds you, he won't thank you for saving his life. He'll kill you to keep his secret. Elisa stumbled, her legs weak. As he dragged her toward the exit of the tunnel, a sudden, violent jolt of electricity shot through her brain. Her eyes rolled back and the damp walls of the tunnel vanished. In her mind, she saw a field of white lilies being soaked in blood. She saw Arthur Sullivan standing over a grave, but the grave was empty. And then she saw a hand with a very specific ring, a silver signet of a lion, holding a detonator. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that ring. She had seen it before. He's closer than you think, Elisa choked out, her voice barely a rasp. The one who wants him dead, he's already inside the house. Llewellyn stopped, his grip tightening on her arm. What did you see, Elisa? Tell me. But she couldn't speak. The vision was too intense, a swirling vortex of betrayal and old ghosts. She saw Arthur's face again, not as the ghost, but as the man she had seen today. The man whose eyes held a flicker of the same pain she carried every single day. Back at the safe house, Arthur was looking through a box of old photographs he kept locked in a floor safe. Most were of his business dealings, but at the very bottom, tucked into a hidden compartment, was a single charred Polaroid. It showed a woman with a kind smile, holding a small boy in a park in Seoul. Arthur's thumb traced the woman's face. I'm sorry, Yama, he whispered. I tried to bury it all. I tried to become someone else so the shame wouldn't follow me. The door opened and Tommy walked back in. He noticed the photograph in Arthur's hand but said nothing. He simply set a glass of scotch on the desk. We have a lead, Tommy said. A witness saw a girl matching her description being forced into a black SUV near the old subway entrance. The plates were scrubbed but were tracking the CCTV. Arthur closed the box and locked it. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of the ghost. Get the tactical team ready. Someone has her, they're using her. And if they're using her, they're coming for me again. He looked at Tommy, his most trusted friend. You've been with me a long time, Tommy. You know what I've done to get here. Tommy smiled, a thin, sharp expression. I know exactly what you've done, boss. And I've been right there with you. Arthur reached for his glass, his eyes lingering on Tommy's hand as he adjusted his cufflink. For a split second, the light caught a silver signet ring on Tommy's finger. A lion with its jaws open. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He remembered that ring. He had given it to Tommy 10 years ago as a symbol of their brotherhood. But in the chaos of the afternoon, in the ringing of his ears, he hadn't noticed how tightly Tommy had been gripping the umbrella. How he had been standing just a few inches further back from the blast zone than Arthur. The first seed of doubt was planted, watered by the tears of a girl who knew his name. Arthur Sullivan took a sip of the scotch. It burned all the way down. I'm sure you have, Tommy, Arthur said, his voice as smooth as glass. I'm sure you've been right there the whole time. The game had changed. The hunter was being hunted, But for the first time in 20 years, the ghost wasn't alone in the shadows. He had a name, he had a past, and somewhere out there he had a savior who held the keys to his redemption, or his final execution. The night didn't just fall. It collapsed over the city, heavy and suffocating. Arthur Sullivan stood in the center of his private armory, the cold weight of a customized .45 caliber pistol familiar in his palm. He wasn't wearing his charcoal overcoat anymore. He was in a tactical turtleneck and a dark, reinforced vest. He looked less like a CO and more like the Reaper he had been in his 20s. The lead Tommy had provided pointed to an abandoned textile mill on the edge of the river, a skeletal remains of industry that now served as a graveyard for secrets. Arthur knew it was a trap. Every instinct honed over a lifetime of violence told him that walking into that mill was a death sentence. But the girl who knew his name, was the only thread left connecting him to a soul he thought he'd traded for power. "The teams are in position, boss," Tommy said, stepping into the room. He was checking the action on his own rifle. The silver signet ring on his finger glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights, a tiny metallic lion mocking Arthur with every movement. "We breach the north and south exits simultaneously. If she's inside, we'll have her in 3 minutes." Arthur looked at Tommy. He looked at the man who had been his shadow for 2 decades. The urge to press the barrel of his gun against Tommy's temple was a physical thrum in his veins, but he held it back. If he killed Tommy now, he'd never find the girl. He needed the traitor to lead him to the prize. "No," Arthur said, his voice a low, vibrating chord. "I go in alone. You and the teams hold the perimeter. If I'm not out in 10 minutes, level the building." Tommy's eyes flickered. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. "That's suicide, Arthur. We don't know who's in there." "I know exactly who's in there," Arthur lied, stepping past him. "A ghost. And you can't kill a ghost with a tactical team." As Arthur drove toward the mill, the rain turned into a torrential downpour, blurring the world into a series of gray, jagged shapes. He felt a strange, terrifying electricity in the air. It was the same feeling he'd had 24 years ago in Seoul, the night he had been ordered to clean up a residential block to make way for a development project. He had been young, hungry, and heartless. He had set the fires. He had watched the buildings burn. He pulled up to the mill, the tires of his black SUV crunching on broken glass. The building loomed over him, a jagged tooth of brick and rusted steel. He didn't wait for his heart rate to settle. He moved. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and decay. Arthur moved through the shadows like a predator, his footsteps silent. He followed the sound of a low, rhythmic humming. It was a melody, a lullaby his mother used to sing to him in the small kitchen of their apartment in Busan. He rounded a corner into a wide, open floor where the moonlight filtered through the shattered roof. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair. And sitting in that chair, unbound but unmoving, was Elisa. She looked smaller here, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the mill. Her copper hair was matted with blood, and her blue eyes were fixed on a point in the air that only she could see. "You came," she whispered, her voice carrying through the cavernous space. Arthur kept his gun lowered, but he didn't holster it. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" Elisa finally turned her head. The look in her eyes wasn't one of fear. It was a look of profound, agonizing recognition. "I didn't just know your name, Min-jae. I saw you standing in the hallway of the apartment on 4th Street. You were holding a lighter. You looked at me and for a second I thought you were going to save us." Arthur felt the floor beneath him tilt. The memory hit him like a physical blow. A little girl in a pink nightgown, clutching a teddy bear, staring at him through the smoke of a burning hallway. He had told himself everyone in that building was gone. He had told himself he was just a soldier. "The Vance family," Arthur breathed, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "You're the daughter. You were supposed to be dead." "I am dead," Elisa said, standing up slowly. Her legs trembled, but her gaze was unwavering. "The girl you saw died in that fire. I'm just what was left behind. Woolen found me. He told me I was special. He told me my fever dreams were a gift." Before Arthur could respond, a heavy metallic clank echoed through the room. The steel shutters on the windows slammed shut, plunging them into near-total darkness. Red emergency lights flickered on, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor. "You shouldn't have come alone, Arthur," a voice boomed over the mill's intercom. It wasn't Llewellyn. It was Tommy. Arthur spun around, his gun raised, but the room was empty. Tommy. Show yourself. I've spent 20 years in your shadow, Arthur. Tommy's voice was distorted, filled with a jagged, simmering rage. I watched you play philanthropist, while I did the dirty work. I watched you try to wash the blood off your hands with money, while I was the one keeping the empire from collapsing. You're weak. You've been weak since the day you spared that girl. Spare her. Arthur roared. I thought she was dead. Llewellyn found her shivering in the rubble. Tommy laughed, the sound cold and echoing. He brought her to me. We realized what she could do. She didn't just see the fire, Arthur. She sees everything. Every rival's move, every police raid, every betrayal. She's been the one running this city for the last 3 years. I just whispered the questions. Elisa looked at Arthur, tears streaming down her face. He made me watch, she choked out. Every time I had a vision of someone coming for you, he made me tell him so he could set the traps. He used me to kill your enemies so he could become your only friend. The betrayal was a jagged blade in Arthur's gut. Tommy hadn't just been planning a coup. He had been parasitic, feeding off the trauma of the girl Arthur had orphaned. But today was supposed to be the end, Tommy continued. The Black Vault was the reset button. With the families gone and you dead, I'd be the one to pick up the pieces. But she warned you. She ruined everything. Suddenly, the floor beneath Arthur's feet hissed. A cloud of thick white gas began to pour from the vents in the floor. Arthur, run. Elisa screamed. She lunged toward him, her small hand catching his wrist. As she touched him, a violent surge of images flooded Arthur's mind. It wasn't his memory, it was hers. He saw the world as she saw it, a kaleidoscope of shifting futures. He saw Tommy standing on a rooftop across the street holding a remote detonator. He saw a black SUV speeding toward the mill. And he saw himself, protecting her. I won't leave you again, Arthur growled, his voice thick with a new, burning resolve. He scooped Elisa up, her light frame feeling like nothing in his arms, and charged toward the loading dock. Behind them, the first of the tactical charges Tommy had planted began to detonate. The mill groaned as a support pillar collapsed. Arthur dived through a glass window just as the center of the floor erupted in a fireball. They tumbled onto the wet gravel outside, the heat of the blast searing the back of Arthur's neck. He looked up, gasping for air, and saw the headlights of 3 black SUVs circling them like sharks. Tommy stepped out of the lead vehicle, his rifle leveled at Arthur's chest. It's over, boss, Tommy said, his face illuminated by the burning mill. The ghost finally meets his end in the fire. It's poetic, don't you think? But Arthur wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking at Elisa, who was staring past Tommy at the dark river behind him. Her eyes were glowing with that terrifying blue light. The bridge, she whispered. The bridge is out. Before Tommy could pull the trigger, a deafening roar drowned out the rain. A massive freighter, lost in the storm and its navigation jammed by Llewellyn's tech, slammed into the supports of the riverside bridge. The concrete structure buckled and collapsed directly onto the road where Tommy's SUVs were parked. Chaos erupted. The ground shook as tons of concrete and steel crushed the lead vehicles. Tommy dived out of the way just in time, his rifle skidding across the pavement. Arthur didn't hesitate. He grabbed Elisa and sprinted toward his own vehicle, which had been shielded by a brick wall. He threw her into the passenger seat and floored it, the tires screaming as they tore away from the carnage. As they sped into the night, the mill burning behind them, Arthur looked at his hands. They were covered in soot and blood. For the first time in 24 years, he wasn't running from his past. He was carrying it with him in the passenger seat. The hunt had begun. The empire was gone. His best friend was his greatest enemy. And the girl whose life he had destroyed was the only person who could see the path to his survival. The engine of the black SUV groaned as Arthur pushed it toward the jagged skyline of the outskirts. Beside him, Elisa was a ghost of a girl, her head lolling against the window, her breath fogging the glass in rhythmic, shallow bursts. Every time lightning fractured the sky, Arthur caught a glimpse of her reflection, pale, bruised, and hauntingly beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten with a sensation he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't just guilt. It was a terrifying, magnetic pull toward the one person who should hate him most. He didn't take her to any of the syndicate's safe houses. Those were Tommy's territory now. Instead, he drove 3 hours north into the suffocating density of the Pine Barrens, to a place even the ghost had forgotten. It was a hunting lodge he had purchased under the name Minjae Park 20 years ago, a name on a deed that existed in no digital database. The lodge was a skeletal structure of cedar and stone, smelling of damp earth and stagnant time. He killed the lights and rolled the car into the overgrown garage. The silence that followed the engines cut feeling heavier than the roar of the storm. "We're here," Arthur said, his voice sounding like gravel in the quiet. Elisa didn't move. Her eyes were open but they were fixed on the dashboard. "He's burning the city to find me," she whispered. "I can feel the heat. Tommy, he's not just looking for a girl. He's looking for his god. Without my eyes he's just a man with a gun and he can't stand being ordinary." Arthur climbed out and walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door and reached in, intending to help her out, but as his fingers brushed her shoulder, she flinched so violently she struck the seatbelt buckle. "I'm not going to hurt you," Arthur said, the lie tasting like poison. "I already did. I destroyed everything you were before you even knew what the world was." "You already did, Minjae," she said, finally meeting his gaze. The use of his name felt like a physical weight. "But the fire in my head says you're the only one who can stop the next one." He carried her into the lodge. She was light, dangerously so, as if the visions were slowly consuming her physical form. He laid her on a dusty velvet sofa and set to work. He didn't have a medic here. He had a first aid kit, a bottle of bourbon, and the steady hands of a man who had spent his life stitching up his own soul. As the fireplace crackled to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the room, the tension between them shifted. It wasn't the tension of a captor and a prisoner anymore. It was something more intimate, more dangerous. Arthur knelt beside her, a warm cloth in his hand. He began to wipe the dried blood and soot from her forehead. His movements were clinical, but his heart was a chaotic mess. He found himself noticing the curve of her jaw, the way her copper hair caught the firelight, and the profound, tragic depth in her blue eyes. He was 52. A man who had forgotten the touch of anything that wasn't steel or silk. And yet, looking at this 19-year-old girl, the living embodiment of his greatest sin, he felt a surge of protectiveness that bordered on obsession. "Why did you save me?" he asked, his voice low. "At the club. At the mill. You could have let the fire take me. It would have been justice." Elisa looked up at him, her hand trembling as she reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his face. "Because when I see the future I don't just see what happens. I feel what people feel. And when I looked at you, I didn't see the ghost. I saw a man who has been screaming in a room with no windows for 24 years. I saw a man who wanted to be found." Arthur caught her hand. His skin was rough, calloused from years of violence. Hers was soft, fragile as parchment. The contact sent a jolt through him, a shared vulnerability that made the air in the room feel thin. For a moment the world outside, Tommy's betrayal, the collapsing empire, the hunt, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the fire and the impossible connection between a murderer and his victim. "I can't change what I did," Arthur rasped, his grip on her hand tightening ever so slightly. "The night on 4th Street. I was a different man. But that doesn't make the blood go away." "The blood is already there, Minjae," Elisa said, her voice a soft, melodic ache. "The question is whether you're going to use it to drown or to write a new ending." The moment was shattered by a sudden, sharp intake of breath from Elisa. Her body went rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. She let out a choked cry, her fingers clawing at Arthur's sleeves. "They're coming," she gasped, her voice distorted as if two people were speaking through her throat. "Not Tommy. Not yet. The man with the white hair. Victor Sterling." Arthur's blood turned to ice. Victor Sterling was his mentor. The man who had taught him how to disappear, how to build a kingdom from the shadows. Victor had retired 10 years ago to a private island. If Victor was involved, this wasn't just a coup by Tommy. It was a systematic erasure of Arthur Sullivan. "Victor." Arthur stood up, his hand going to his holster. "He's out of the game. He has no reason to come for me." "He never left," Elisa cried, her body beginning to convulse. "He's the one who gave Tommy the detonator. He's the one who told Llewellyn to keep me. He's the High Architect. He wants the city to burn so he can build a new one in the ashes. He's at the Blackwood docks. He's waiting for the shipment." "What shipment?" "The cradles," she whispered, her voice fading as the vision ebbed. Small, heavy, lead-lined. He's going to level the entire district, Arthur. Not just the bosses. Everyone. The horror of it hit him. A scorched earth policy. Victor wasn't just taking over. He was resetting the board by murdering thousands. Arthur paced the room, his mind firing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. He needed to strike back, but he was one man. He looked at Elisa, who was slumped against the sofa, exhausted and pale. I have to go to the docks, Arthur said. No, Elisa said, her voice gaining a sudden fierce strength. If you go now, you die. I've seen it. There's a sniper in the North Crane. Tommy is there too. It's a trap within a trap. I can't just sit here and let him kill thousands of people to spite me. You're not sitting here, she said, standing up on shaky legs. She walked toward him, her blue eyes burning with an intensity that commanded him to listen. You're going to find Sarah Corleone, the widow of the West Side. She hates Victor more than you do. She has the men you need. Arthur shook his head. Sarah won't talk to me. We've been at war for 5 years. She will talk to Min-jae, Elisa said, stepping into his personal space. She placed a hand on his chest, right over his pounding heart. Tell her about the girl in the pink nightgown. Tell her about the fire on 4th Street. She was there, Arthur. She was the one who pulled me out of the rubble before Llewellyn found me. She's been looking for me for years. The revelation was a thunderclap. The web was more complex than he had ever imagined. Sarah Corleone, his fiercest rival, was the secret protector of the girl he had orphaned. Why are you telling me this now? Arthur asked, his voice a whisper. Because I'm tired of being a weapon, Arthur, she said, her eyes welling with tears. I want to be a person again. And I think you're the only one who can help me find her. The attraction between them, once a simmering undercurrent, flared into a desperate, grounding need. Arthur reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. He didn't kiss her. The weight of their history was too heavy for that, but he leaned in until their foreheads touched, a silent vow passing between them in the flickering firelight. I will get you to her, Arthur promised. And then I will end this. For both of us. While Arthur and Elisa found a brief, fragile peace in the woods, the city was a cauldron of violence. In a high-rise penthouse overlooking the burning ruins of the Black Vault, Tommy Miller stood before a bank of monitors. His face was a mask of cold fury. He had lost Arthur at the bridge, and the ghost was proving to be as elusive as his name suggested. The tracking on the SUV died near the state line, a man said, stepping into the room. He was older, with shocking white hair and a suit that cost a fortune. Victor Sterling didn't look like a monster. He looked like a statesman. He's smart, Tommy, Victor said, pouring a glass of 30-year-old cognac. You underestimated his will to live. And you certainly underestimated the girl's loyalty to him. She's not loyal, Tommy spat. She's broken. He's just the first person she saw when she woke up from her trance. Regardless, Victor said, his eyes cold as Arctic ice. The Cradles arrive at midnight. If Sullivan is still alive, he'll try to stop us. He'll go to Sarah. He's predictable when he's desperate. Tommy gripped his rifle. I'll be waiting at the west side border. If he shows his face, I'll take it off. Do not fail me again, Tommy, Victor said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more threat than any shout. The ghost needs to be exorcised. And the girl is a loose thread. If we can't have her visions, no one can. Tommy nodded, his silver signet ring, the lion, glinting in the dark. He had already set the red herrings in motion. He had leaked a false location to Arthur's remaining loyalists, a bait he knew would draw them out into an ambush. He was playing the long game, turning Arthur's own empire against him. Back at the lodge, Arthur was preparing to leave. He had found an old, unregistered motorcycle in the shed. He looked at Elisa, who was wrapped in a thick wool blanket he'd found in a chest. Stay here, he said. The cellar is reinforced. Don't come out for anyone but me. Arthur, she called out as he reached the door. He stopped, the name Arthur sounding strange coming from her. She usually called him Min-jae. Be careful, she said. The man in the crane, he's not looking for you. He's looking for the girl. Arthur frowned. What do you mean? The vision changed, Elisa said, her voice trembling. They don't want to kill you yet. They want to use you to lure me out. They know you'll come for me. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He realized then that he wasn't just a protector. He was the bait. Then I'll make sure they regret ever setting the trap, Arthur said. He kicked the motorcycle to life, the roar of the engine echoing through the pines. As he tore down the dirt path toward the city, his mind was a whirlwind of tactical maneuvers and emotional revelations. He was going to find Sarah Corleone. He was going to stop Victor. And he was going to save the girl who had given him back his name. But as he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw a single red light blinking on the underside of the garage door he had just closed. A tracker. Tommy hadn't lost them. He had let them lead him to their sanctuary. The tension snapped like a dry twig. The hunt wasn't coming, it was already there. The rain had transitioned into a sleet that stung like needles as Arthur tore through the backroads of the west side. He pushed the old motorcycle to its absolute limit, the engine screaming a mechanical prayer against the wind. His mind was a battlefield. He kept seeing Elise's eyes, not the glazed, terrifying blue of her visions, but the soft human blue of the girl who had looked at him in the lodge and seen a man worth saving. He arrived at the gates of the McLean estate at 2 a.m. It was a neo-Gothic fortress perched on a cliff overlooking the churning Atlantic, protected by a wall of black iron and a dozen men with thermal optics. Arthur didn't try to sneak in. He rode the bike straight up to the main gate, skidding to a halt as 3 red laser dots settled on his chest. "I'm Arthur Sullivan," he roared over the wind. "Tell Sarah McLean that Min Jae is here to settle a debt from 4th Street. The silence that followed was long enough for Arthur to count his own racing heartbeats. Then the heavy iron gates groaned open. He was escorted into a drawing room that felt like a cathedral of grief. The walls were lined with portraits of the fallen, and the air smelled of lilies and old gunpowder. At the far end of the room, sitting in a high-backed wing chair, was Sarah McLean. She was 60, with hair as white as a mountain peak and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of 3 crime dynasties. "You have a lot of nerve coming here, Arthur," Sarah said, her voice a low, melodic rasp. She didn't have a gun out, but her hand rested on the head of a massive Doberman that watched Arthur with hungry eyes. "The last time we spoke you told me if I ever crossed into your docks, you'd hang me from a crane." "The world changed 6 hours ago, Sarah," Arthur said, stepping into the light. He was covered in soot, his tactical gear torn, the blood on his hands now a dried, dark crust. "Victor Sterling is back. He's using Tommy Miller to purge the city. And he's got Elisa Vance." Sarah went perfectly still. The name Elisa Vance acted like a physical blow. She stood up, her silk robe billowing around her. "Elisa is dead. She died in the fire you ordered 24 years ago." "She didn't," Arthur said, his voice cracking. "I saw her. I've been with her. Victor's people found her in the rubble. They've been using her, Sarah. They've been using her visions to run our lives like puppets on a string." Sarah walked toward him, her footsteps silent. When she reached him, she didn't strike him. She looked into his eyes with a terrifying, piercing intensity. "You ordered that hit, Arthur. You told me the Vance family were informants. You told me they had to be erased. I was a soldier." Arthur yelled, the frustration of 2 decades finally boiling over. "Victor told me they were a threat to the family. I did what I was told." "You were a fool," Sarah whispered. She turned and walked toward a safe hidden behind a painting of a weeping saint. She punched in a code and pulled out a weathered, yellowed envelope. "Victor didn't send you to kill informants that night, Arthur. He sent you to kill the truth." She tossed the envelope onto a low table. Arthur's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were documents, birth certificates, property deeds, and a single grainy photograph. The photograph showed a younger Victor Sterling standing next to a man who looked remarkably like Arthur. In fact, the resemblance was uncanny. Between them stood a woman, the same woman from Arthur's charred Polaroid. His mother. "What is this?" Arthur whispered, the world beginning to spin. "Your mother didn't just die in Busan, Arthur," Sarah said, her voice dripping with a bitter, cold pity. "She fled. She fled from Victor Sterling. He was obsessed with her, a man who couldn't handle the word no. She changed her name, moved to the States, and married a man named Thomas Vance." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He collapsed into a chair, the papers fluttering to the floor. "Thomas Vance. Elisa's father. He was my stepfather." "He was the man who saved your mother," Sarah said. "And Elisa. Elisa is your sister, Arthur. Your half-sister. The revelation was a tectonic shift. It didn't just change the story, it shattered Arthur's entire reality. The girl he had orphaned, the girl whose life he had destroyed, the girl he had felt a strange magnetic pull toward. She was his own blood. Victor knew, Arthur rasped, the realization dawning on him like a cold, gray sunrise. He knew who they were. He sent me to kill my own family, to blood me. To make sure there was nothing left of Minjae but a monster he could control. He wanted to break you so completely that you'd never look back, Sarah said. But he didn't realize Elisa survived. And he didn't realize that I knew. I tried to find her, Arthur. I really did. But Llewellyn Vane was faster. He's been Victor's lapdog since the beginning. Arthur stood up, a new kind of fire burning in his eyes. It wasn't the cold, calculating fire of the ghost. It was the white-hot rage of a man who had finally found his purpose. The cradles, Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Elisa mentioned them. She said they were at the Blackwood docks. She thought they were bombs. Sarah shook her head. No. The cradles aren't bombs. They're digital archives. The cradles of the new world. They contain the ledgers, the offshore accounts, and the blackmail material for every politician, judge, and police chief in this country. Victor isn't just resetting the gangs, Arthur. He's taking over the infrastructure of the entire state. If those cradles are loaded onto that freighter, he becomes untouchable. And once the ship is clear, he'll level the district to hide the evidence of the transfer. He's going to kill her, Arthur said, his heart hammering against his ribs. He has no use for her once he has the cradles. He'll leave her in the blast zone. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the drawing room burst open. One of Sarah's guards stumbled in, his chest riddled with gunfire. They're here, he gasped before collapsing. Outside, the night erupted. A fleet of black SUVs tore across the lawn, their headlights cutting through the sleet like the eyes of predators. In the lead vehicle, Tommy Miller sat with a thermal-scoped rifle, a cold, predatory smile on his face. He followed you, Sarah hissed, reaching into her robe and pulling out a silver-plated revolver. You brought the devil to my doorstep, Arthur. I didn't just bring him, Arthur said, checking his pistol. I lured him. He thinks I'm here for a treaty. He doesn't know I know. Arthur turned to Sarah. I need your men. I need every gun you have. Not for me. For Elisa. For the sister I tried to kill. Sarah looked at the blood on Arthur's face. The blood of his past and the blood of the man he was becoming. She nodded slowly. For the Vances, she said. At the lodge, the red light on the garage door finally stopped blinking. Elisa sat in the center of the living room, her eyes wide and fixed on the door. She didn't need a tracker to know they were there. She could feel the vibration of the tires on the dirt road. She could hear the thoughts of the men outside, jagged, dark thoughts of fire and silence. Llewellyn Vane stepped through the front door, his tactical boots thudding on the hardwood. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He looked like a disappointed father. You should have stayed in the tunnel, Elisa, he said, shaking his head. You had a good life. We kept you safe. We kept you fed. You kept me in a cage. Elisa screamed, her voice echoing through the empty house. You used my pain to build a graveyard. Llewellyn stepped closer, his hand reaching for her hair. And now you're going to help us one last time. We need to know where the ghost is going. We need to know his final move. Elisa looked up at him, and for the first time in years she didn't see the fractured mirror of the future. She saw the present. She saw the man in front of her for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind a girl's trauma. She smiled, a thin, sharp expression that made Llewellyn pause. He's not coming for the ghost, she whispered. What? Minjae is coming, she said. And he's not alone. Before Llewellyn could react, a sudden violent flash of white light filled the room. The windows shattered inward as flashbangs detonated. Through the smoke, a figure moved with the speed of a vengeful spirit. It wasn't Arthur. It was a team of Sarah McLean's elite widowmakers. They had been shadowing Arthur since he left the estate, a contingency plan Sarah hadn't mentioned. The room turned into a whirlwind of gunfire and broken glass. Elisa dived behind the sofa, her hands over her ears. She felt the screams returning, but they weren't terrifying anymore. They were clear. She saw a map of the docks. She saw the crane. And she saw Arthur standing on the deck of a ship, his hand outstretched toward her. Run now, she whispered to herself. But this time she wasn't telling him to run away. She was telling him to run to her. Back at the estate, the battle was a meat grinder. Arthur and Sarah were pinned down behind a marble fountain in the garden. Tommy's men were closing in, using the SUVs as moving cover. We can't hold them here, Sarah shouted over the roar of a submachine gun. We don't have to, Arthur yelled back. He pulled a small black remote from his vest, a device he had taken from the safe house earlier. I didn't just come here to talk, Sarah. I knew Tommy would track me. I rigged the SUVs at the gate. He pressed the button. A series of synchronized explosions ripped through the driveway. The SUVs Tommy's men were using for cover turned into pillars of fire. In the chaos, Arthur stood up, his .45 barked twice, dropping two of Tommy's lead enforcers. He saw Tommy across the lawn, diving behind a stone statue of a lion. Their eyes met through the smoke and the sleet. Two men who had been brothers, now separated by a sea of blood and lies. It's over, Tommy, Arthur roared. I know about the cradles. I know about Victor. Tommy's face contorted with rage. It doesn't matter what you know, Arthur. You're a relic. The world belongs to the ones who control the data, not the ones who control the docs. Tommy raised his rifle, but before he could fire, a black helicopter marked with the McLean crest rose from behind the cliffside, its miniguns spinning up. Go! Sarah screamed at Arthur. My pilots will take you to the docks. I'll finish this here. Arthur didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the helipad, bullets kicking up the dirt at his heels. As he pulled himself into the chopper, he looked down at the burning estate. The ghost was dead. The Mafia boss was gone. There was only Minjay, a man racing against the clock to save the sister he had spent a lifetime unknowingly hunting. The stakes had never been higher. The betrayal had never been deeper. And the truth was finally terrifyingly clear. The helicopter bucked like a wounded beast as it cleared the jagged cliffs of the McLean estate. Below, the Atlantic was a churning cauldron of black ink and white foam, reflecting the chaotic fire that still consumed Sarah's gardens. Arthur Sullivan, or Minjay, the name that now felt like a brand on his soul, clung to the frame of the open door, his knuckles white against the cold steel. The wind screamed, a 1,000-mile-an-hour howl that drowned out everything but the rhythmic thrum of the rotors. Every vibration of the aircraft seemed to pulse in time with the revelation that had shattered his world. Elisa is my sister. The girl whose parents he had murdered. The girl whose childhood he had turned into a funeral pyre. She wasn't just a victim. She was the last piece of a family he thought had been erased from the earth. 3 minutes out, Sullivan, the pilot yelled, his voice crackling through the headset. The Blackwood docks are hot. I'm seeing at least 50 tangos on the perimeter and a freighter, the Acheron, ready to cast off. Arthur looked down at the city. From this height, the lights of the district he had ruled for 20 years looked like dying embers. He had built a kingdom on a foundation of ash, never realizing the architect of his rise was the same man who had orchestrated the slaughter of his blood. Victor Sterling hadn't just been a mentor. He had been a farmer, and Arthur had been his most successful crop. A heartless, efficient weapon grown in the soil of trauma. Drop me at the crane line, Arthur commanded. I'm going in low. And once I'm out, you get back to Sarah. If I don't signal in 20 minutes, tell her to call the authorities. Not the local precinct, the state guard. Tell them there's a biological and digital threat on the water. The helicopter tilted sharply, diving toward the massive skeletal structures of the Blackwood shipping cranes. These were the rusted giants that fed the city, and tonight, they were the gallows where Arthur's past and future would meet. He leaped from the skid while the chopper was still 10 feet above the roof of a stack of shipping containers. He hit the corrugated metal hard, the impact jarring his teeth and sending a flare of agony through his bruised ribs. He didn't wait to recover. He rolled, came up with his .45 drawn, and disappeared into the labyrinth of steel. The docks were a nightmare of industrial scale. Thousands of containers, red, blue, gray, formed a city of narrow alleys and dead ends. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, salt, and the ozone of the approaching electrical storm. Somewhere ahead, the Acheron hummed with the vibration of its massive engines, a low-frequency growl that felt like a predator purring. Arthur moved with a desperate, frantic precision. He was a ghost in his own graveyard. He took out 2 of Tommy's sentries with silent, efficient strikes. A snap of the neck here, a knife to the kidney there. He wasn't the ghost of the docks anymore. He was a man possessed by a single terrifying goal. He rounded a corner near the primary loading dock and froze. In the center of the staging area, under the glare of harsh floodlights, stood the cradles. They were 12 lead-line chests, each the size of a coffin, being hoisted by a magnetic crane toward the deck of the Acheron. Standing beside them was Victor Sterling. He looked immaculate even in the rain, his white hair gleaming, his posture that of a man who had already won. And standing next to him, her copper hair a shock of color against the gray steel, was Elisa. She looked broken. Her eyes were glazed, her body swaying as if she were caught in a permanent trance. Llewellyn Vane stood behind her, his hand wrapped firmly around her upper arm, his other hand holding a small silver device. A neurostimulator designed to force the visions, even when the brain was screaming for rest. "I know you're here, Minjae." Victor's voice boomed over the dock's public address system. It was calm, conversational, and utterly terrifying. "I taught you everything you know. I know you're lurking in the shadows of Container Row 4. I know your heart rate is 110 beats per minute. I know you're feeling a sentimentality that I thought I had burned out of you 20 years ago." Arthur stayed low, his back pressed against a rusted red container. He was trapped. There were snipers on the cranes and a dozen men between him and the girl. "It's a beautiful irony, isn't it?" Victor continued, his voice echoing off the steel walls. "You spent your life trying to find the man who killed your family, never realizing you were the one holding the lighter. And now you want to be the hero. But heroes don't exist in the world we built, Minjae. There are only masters and the things they own." Suddenly, a heavy boot slammed into Arthur's shoulder, sending him sprawling into the open. He scrambled to his feet, but a rifle caught him in the jaw, spinning him around. He hit the wet concrete, his gun skittering away into the darkness. Tommy Miller stepped into the light, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He wasn't the calm lieutenant anymore. He was a man who had been rejected by his god and was looking to take it out on the temple. "You always were the favorite," Tommy spat, kicking Arthur in the ribs. Arthur groaned, blood pooling in his mouth. "Victor talked about you like you were some kind of masterpiece. But look at you now. A broken old man crying over a girl who doesn't even know who you are." Tommy grabbed Arthur by the collar and hauled him to his feet, dragging him toward the center of the loading zone. He threw Arthur down at Victor's feet. Victor looked down at Arthur with a flicker of genuine disappointment. "You disappointed me, Arthur. You had the world at your feet, and you threw it away for a name you were never supposed to hear again." Arthur looked up, his vision blurred by blood and rain. He looked at Elisa. She was staring at him, but there was no recognition in her eyes, only a terrifying, empty void. "Let her go, Victor," Arthur rasped, his voice a wet wheeze. "The cradles. You have them. You have the city. Just let the girl go." "I can't do that," Victor said softly. "You see, Elisa is the most valuable part of the shipment. Data can be decrypted. Ledgers can be forged. But a girl who can see the future. She's the ultimate insurance policy. As long as I have her, I will never be surprised again." Victor leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And as for you, you were my greatest achievement. But every masterpiece needs a final, tragic act." "Tommy." Tommy stepped forward, his silver signet ring, the lion, catching the light as he pulled a long, serrated blade from his belt. "With pleasure, boss." Arthur tried to fight, but his body was a wreckage of pain. He watched as Tommy raised the knife, the rain slicking the steel. He looked at Elisa one last time, wanting her to be the last thing he saw. "Elisa." He breathed. Suddenly, Elisa's body went into a violent convulsion. Her eyes snapped from white to a brilliant electric blue. She let out a scream that wasn't a human sound. It was a frequency that shattered the glass of the nearby floodlights, plunging the docks into a strobing, terrifying semi-darkness. "The water!" she shrieked. "The water is burning." A split second later, the Acheron groaned. A massive explosion rocked the hull of the ship, not from Arthur's doing but from the freighter's own fuel lines, sabotaged by the very men Victor had hired to protect it. Sarah McLean hadn't just sent a helicopter. She had sent a team of divers to ensure the ship never left the harbor. The shockwave threw everyone to the ground. In the chaos, Arthur saw his opening. He lunged for Tommy's legs, tackling him into the oily water of the harbor. They went under into the freezing, lightless depths. Arthur felt Tommy's hands on his throat, the traitor's strength fueled by a lifetime of resentment. They thrashed in the dark, the silhouettes of sinking debris falling around them like black snow. Arthur's lungs burned, his vision darkening. This was it. The darkest hour. He was going to die in the cold, a nameless ghost in a city that had already forgotten him. He felt the knife, Tommy's knife, pierce his shoulder. The pain was a cold shock that jolted him back to consciousness. With a roar of primal defiance, Arthur grabbed Tommy's wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped. He kicked off the submerged hull of a container and drove his elbow into Tommy's temple. Tommy's grip loosened. His eyes went wide as the last of his breath escaped in a silver cloud of bubbles. He drifted away into the darkness, the silver lion ring the last thing Arthur saw of the man he had called brother. Arthur broke the surface, gasping for air that tasted of salt and fire. The docks were a war zone. The Acheron was listing heavily, fire spreading across its deck. Victor Sterling was gone, vanished into the smoke like the phantom he was. But Elisa was still there. She was standing on the edge of the pier, Llewellyn Vane holding a gun to her head, his face a mask of panicked desperation. "Don't move, Sullivan," Llewellyn screamed. "I'll kill her. I swear to God I'll take her with me." Arthur stood on the edge of the sinking ship, his blood mixing with the rain. He was alone. His empire was gone. His enemy was still at large. His sister was a second away from death. And the entire dock was rigged to blow as the fire reached the cradles. The situation was hopeless. He had lost everything. Arthur Sullivan hauled himself out of the freezing, oily sludge of the harbor, his fingers clawing at the jagged underside of the concrete pier. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, a chorus of agony led by the deep, throbbing ache of the knife wound in his shoulder. The salt water stung the raw opening, a reminder that he was still tethered to the living world by a very thin, very frayed thread. He collapsed onto the wet pavement, gasping for air that tasted like a cocktail of jet fuel and burning plastic. Above him, the sky was no longer black. It was a bruised purple, lit from beneath by the funeral pyre of the Acheron. The freighter was tilting further into the depths, its hull groaning like a dying leviathan. "Look at you," a voice sneered, cutting through the roar of the flames. Arthur looked up. Through the haze of blood and rain, he saw Llewellyn Hunt standing 30 feet away. The man was a shadow against the fire, his tactical silhouette sharp and unforgiving. He held Elisa by the hair, her head pulled back at a painful angle, the barrel of a suppressed pistol pressed firmly against her temple. Elisa wasn't screaming. She wasn't even crying. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together too many times. Her blue eyes were fixed on Arthur, not with the distance of a seer but with a raw, terrifying clarity. "The great ghost of the docks," Llewellyn laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. "Turned into a wet rat in the gutter. Victor is already at the secondary extraction point with the final cradle. He's left us here to die in the blast, Sullivan. But I'm not going out alone. I'm taking the girl and I'm taking you." Arthur didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon he no longer had. Instead, he forced himself to sit up, his spine straight, his gaze never leaving Elisa's. "You think you're in control, Llewellyn?" Arthur's voice was a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to come from his very bones. "You've spent 3 years feeding off the trauma of a child. You think that makes you a predator? Makes you a parasite. And parasites die when the host stops providing." "Shut up," Llewellyn screamed, his grip tightening on Elisa's hair. "I'll do it. I'll pull the trigger right now." "Then do it," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried over the storm. "But look at her eyes first, Llewellyn. Look at what she's seeing." Llewellyn hesitated, his gaze flickering down to Elisa. For the first time in her life, Elisa wasn't seeing a flash. She wasn't seeing a fractured future of fire and blood. She was seeing the man in front of her. She was seeing Minjay. She saw the boy who had once been a soldier of shadows, now standing in the light of his own destruction, offering her the one thing no one else ever had: a choice. "Don't see the fire, Elisa," Arthur's mind called out to her, a silent bridge of shared blood and shared sin. "See me." In that moment, the screams in Elisa's head, the chaotic overlapping timelines that had haunted her since the night on 4th Street, suddenly fell silent. The storm in her mind reached its eye. The blue light in her eyes didn't flare. It deepened, turning from an electric spark into a steady, sapphire flame. She didn't fight Llewellyn. She didn't struggle. She simply reached up and placed her small, cold hand over the hand Llewellyn used to hold the gun. "You're not in my future anymore," Elisa whispered. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed across the docks, but it wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of a heavy-duty steel cable snapping on the primary crane above them. The massive magnetic hoist, destabilized by the earlier explosion, swung down like a pendulum of God's own wrath. Llewellyn looked up, his eyes widening in a split second of realization. He tried to dive away, tried to pull Elisa with him, but Arthur was already moving. Despite the hole in his shoulder, despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull him into a permanent sleep, Arthur launched himself forward. He didn't tackle Llewellyn. He tackled Elisa, his body acting as a shield as the two of them rolled across the wet concrete. The hoist slammed into the pier exactly where they had been standing. The impact was tectonic, shattering the concrete and sending Llewellyn Hunt flying backward into the burning wreckage of a shipping container. There was no scream. There was only the sound of twisted metal and the hiss of the encroaching tide. Silence fell over their small corner of the apocalypse. Arthur lay on the ground, his chest heaving. He felt a weight on his heart, not the weight of guilt but the weight of a living, breathing person. Elisa was huddled against him, her face buried in the crook of his neck. She was shaking, a rhythmic, violent tremor that spoke of 10 years of suppressed terror finally breaking free. Arthur reached up with his good arm and wrapped it around her. He held her with a fervousness he hadn't known he possessed. "I've got you," he breathed into her hair. "I've got you, Elisa. I'm not letting go." She pulled back just enough to look at him. The blue light was gone. Her eyes were just blue now, the human blue of a girl who had finally come home. "Minjae," she whispered. "I'm here," he said. "He's not at the extraction point," she said, her voice gaining a sudden crystalline strength. "Victor." He lied to Llewellyn. "He's not leaving yet. He's in the lighthouse at the North Point. He's waiting for the storm to peak so he can use the signal jammer to mask his escape. He has the final cradle, but he also has the detonator for the district. He's going to level it all at 4 a.m. Arthur looked at his watch. It was 3:42 a.m. "We have 18 minutes, Arthur said. "We don't have a car," Elisa noted, looking at the burning wasteland around them. "We don't need a car," a new voice interrupted. From the shadows of a stack of containers, Sarah McLean stepped out. She was accompanied by 4 of her Widowmakers, their tactical gear slick with rain but their movements as precise as clockwork. Sarah herself was holding a short-barreled shotgun, her white hair windswept and wild. "I thought you'd be halfway to the suburbs by now, Arthur," Sarah said, a grim smile touching her lips. "I had a family matter to attend to," Arthur said, helping Elisa to her feet. Sarah looked at Elisa, and for a moment, the iron-willed matriarch of the West Side looked like she might break. She reached out, her fingers brushing Elisa's cheek. "You look so much like your mother, child." Elisa leaned into the touch. "You saved me from the fire." "I did," Sarah whispered. "And I've spent every day since regretful that I let Llewellyn take you from that hospital." "Not today. Never again." Sarah turned to Arthur, her expression hardening. "The lighthouse is a fortress. Victor has his personal guard there, the Iron Wraiths. My men can get you to the base, but the climb, that's on you." "I'm the only one who can get close enough," Arthur said. "He thinks I'm dead. He's arrogant enough to believe the ghost finally gave up." "He's not just arrogant," Elisa said, her hand finding Arthur's. "He's waiting for you. Deep down he wants you to see what he's built. He wants his masterpiece to have an audience." Arthur looked at his sister. He saw the strength in her, the resilience of a survivor who had been forged in a fire he had started. He realized then that this wasn't just about saving the city or stopping a dictator. It was about the final reclamation of their lives. "Let's go," Arthur said. As they moved toward the McLean SUVs, the rain began to subside, replaced by a thick, oppressive fog that rolled off the Atlantic. The turning point had been reached. The victim had become the guide, the assassin had become the brother, and the empire was nothing but smoke. The final confrontation was waiting at the North Point. The North Point lighthouse stood like a jagged bone jutting out of the Atlantic's throat. It was an ancient structure, built of granite and salt-crusted iron, long since decommissioned by the city but repurposed by Victor Sterling into a digital cathedral. The fog was so thick it felt like a physical weight, dampening the sound of the crashing waves until the world was reduced to the rhythmic, ghostly groan of the sea against the rocks. Arthur Sullivan felt the cold seep into his marrow, but the fire in his chest, a mixture of adrenaline and a brother's desperate love, kept him moving. He was crouched behind a rusted winch on the narrow stone path leading to the lighthouse entrance. Beside him, Elisa was a silent shadow, her blue eyes scanning the darkness. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a soldier of the soul. 6 guards on the exterior, Elisa whispered, her voice steady. They're not looking for a frontal assault. They're looking for a ghost. Then let's give them one, Arthur replied. He looked at Sarah McLean's widowmakers, who were positioned in the tall grass 50 yards back. He gave a sharp 2-fingered signal. Suddenly the night erupted. Sarah's men opened fire with suppressed rifles, creating a chaotic symphony of lead and stone. The Iron Wraiths, Victor's elite guards, responded instantly, drawn toward the diversion. Now, Arthur said. He and Elisa sprinted toward the side service entrance. Arthur's shoulder was a scream of agony with every step, the bandage Sarah had applied already soaked through with fresh blood. He ignored it. He used his good arm to jemmy the heavy iron door, slipping inside into a world of humming servers and flickering green lights. The interior of the lighthouse had been gutted. The spiral staircase remained, but the center was a column of high-end tech. This was the new world Victor had spoken of, a kingdom of data built on a foundation of human misery. Top floor, Elisa said, her hand gripping Arthur's sleeve. He's at the lantern room. He's already started the sequence. They began the climb. Each step was a battle. On the 3rd landing, 2 wraiths stepped out from behind a server rack. Arthur didn't hesitate. He dived forward, his .45 barking twice. The first guard went down, but the second managed to land a kick to Arthur's wounded shoulder. Arthur let out a guttural roar of pain, falling against the wall. The guard raised his weapon, but Elisa was faster. She didn't have a gun. She had a heavy lead pipe she had scavenged from the floor. She swung with a ferocity that came from 10 years of caged rage, catching the guard in the temple. As he stumbled, Arthur finished it with a clean shot. Arthur looked at his sister, panting. You okay? I'm done being afraid, Minjae, she said, her chest heaving. Let's finish this. They reached the lantern room at 3:55 a.m. The space was circular, surrounded by glass that looked out over the burning docks in the distance. In the center sat the final cradle, a sleek black box that looked like a futuristic sarcophagus. And standing at the console, his hands moving with the grace of a pianist, was Victor Sterling. He didn't turn around when they entered. You're 5 minutes early, Arthur. I suppose the helicopter gave you an advantage. It's over, Victor. Arthur shouted, his gun leveled at the back of the old man's head. Abort the sequence. Disconnect the detonator. Victor finally turned. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright with a terrifying messianic zeal. Over. My dear boy, it's only just beginning. The cradles are already broadcasting. Within the hour, every digital record of this city's corruption, and its leadership, will be under my control. I'm not destroying the city, I'm perfecting it. By murdering thousands of people in the blast zone? Arthur growled. That's not perfection. That's a massacre. Unnecessary pruning. Victor dismissed him with a wave of his hand. He looked at Elisa, a strange, predatory smile on his lips. And the girl. The one piece of data I couldn't quantify. You survived the fire twice, Elisa. You truly are a miracle. I'm not a miracle, Elisa said, stepping forward until she was beside Arthur. I'm the witness. I saw what you did to my mother. I saw how you lied to Minjae. Victor's smile faded. I gave him a life. I gave him a kingdom. You gave me a cage made of gold and blood. Arthur roared. You made me kill my own family. And yet here you are, Victor said, his hand drifting toward a red button on the console. The sentimental fool and the broken seer. Do you really think I didn't plan for this? The detonator is linked to my heart rate, Arthur. If you kill me, the district goes up instantly. If I live, it goes up at 4 a.m. unless I enter the override code. The stalemate was absolute. Arthur's finger tightened on the trigger. His mind raced. He could feel the minutes ticking away. 3:57 a.m. There's a third option, Victor, Elisa said suddenly. Her voice was calm, almost melodic. She closed her eyes and for a moment the blue light returned, but it wasn't frantic. It was a soft, steady glow. What are you doing? Victor hissed, his confidence finally flickering. I'm not looking at the future, Elisa whispered. I'm looking at the cradle. She reached out and touched the black box. As her skin made contact with the lead-lined surface, her eyes snapped open. The cradle isn't just data, Victor. You made a mistake. You included the personal files from the Vance estate. You included the recordings my mother made. Victor's face went pale. Those were for my private collection. They're encrypted. Not for me, Elisa said. He turned to Arthur. Minjay, the code. It's not a number. It's a date. The date you were born. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He looked at the console. He saw the keypad. Don't move, Arthur. Victor screamed, his hand hovering over the kill switch. I'll blow it all right now. But Arthur wasn't looking at Victor. He was looking at Elisa. In her eyes he saw a vision, not of fire but of a quiet park in Busan. He saw his mother. He saw a life that could have been. You won't do it, Victor, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, certain rumble. Because you're a coward. You want to rule the world and you can't rule a graveyard. You're obsessed with your legacy and your legacy is sitting in that box. If the district blows, the signal tower goes with it. The broadcast stops. You lose everything. Victor's hand trembled. For the first time in 40 years, the High Architect was uncertain. At that moment, the lighthouse shook. A massive wave slammed into the base, the storm reaching its crescendo. The vibration threw Victor off balance. Arthur didn't fire his gun. He lunged. He tackled Victor, the two of them crashing into the glass windows. The ancient panes shattered and the cold Atlantic wind roared into the room. They grappled on the edge of the abyss, the gray sea churning 100 feet below. Victor clawed at Arthur's eyes, his face a mask of primal rage. I made you. You are nothing without me. I am Minjay. Arthur screamed. With a surge of strength that came from every ounce of his soul, Arthur shoved Victor back. Victor's heel caught on the shattered window frame. He looked at Arthur one last time, a look of pure, unadulterated shock, before he tumbled backward into the night. There was no sound as he fell, only the roar of the wind. The High Architect vanished into the dark water, taken by the same sea that had brought him his power. Arthur collapsed on the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the console. 3:59 and 45 seconds a.m. The code, Arthur. Elisa shouted. Arthur crawled to the keypad. His fingers were slippery with blood. He entered the date of his birth, the one piece of his past he had never been able to forget. 0-9-1-2. The red light on the console blinked once, twice, and then turned a steady, peaceful green. The countdown stopped. The humming of the servers began to wind down. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Arthur had ever heard. He slumped against the console, his head falling back. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a small warm hand. He looked up to see Elisa standing over him, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. We did it, she whispered. We're alive, Arthur rasped, reaching up to take her hand. In the distance, the first light of dawn began to bleed through the fog. The fires at the docks were being brought under control. The city was still standing. The empire of the ghost was dead, but for the first time in 24 years, the man named Minjay was finally, truly free. He looked out at the horizon, the sun catching the copper in Elisa's hair. He had spent his life as a predator, a man of shadows and silence. But as he sat there with his sister, the weight of his sins finally felt manageable. He couldn't bring back the dead, but he could protect the living. Justice had been served not with a bullet but with the truth. And as the morning light filled the lantern room, the shadows of the North Point lighthouse finally began to retreat.